So again, as much as the unemployment rate looks quite... That's great. I'm Paul Cavey. I run a firm called East Asia Econ. I'm based in Taiwan. Often at the heart of people's thinking when they're focusing on East Asia is demographics. And demographics, East Asia really does stand out because the demographics are awful, and the aging of the population that's been happening is led by Asia, and it's led in particular by Japan, which clearly was the first economy that started to go through this, really like the first major economy that started to go through the aging process. Now, I think when we think about this, it's important to remember that there's actually two aspects to what's happening with population change. One is aging, in the sense that people are getting older, they're dying older, and that is important, right? And one of the reasons for that is because the healthcare systems have improved, in a way that's seen in, much more in Asia than, say, in the US these days. So longevity is going up. This is a positive thing, right? This is something which is good for the population. It's good for people's livelihood. So that's something to be welcomed. But that's not the only thing, right? So, and I think it's often, the term that the populations are aging actually is a little bit misleading, because it's not the only thing that's happening. The other thing that's going on is the decline in the birth rate. Now, the decline in the birth rate is also very important, right? Because obviously that means that you have less young people, but it's that means that the population is falling. Obviously, if people are getting older and dying less young, then the population should be growing. But the thing that causes the decline in the population is obviously because the birth rate is falling. Now, why is that a specific issue in Asia? And in fact, it's becoming a bit more global these days. But why was Asia leading this? The OECD has some statistics which were actually used in a Bank of Korea report a few years ago. And it's really like a very striking chart. And the chart is really looking at two things. So one, the age at which people get married. And so if you look at these economies in Asia, they're all, particularly the economies I look at. So, and particularly urban areas in China, but all of the other economies, they're rich economies, right? They're very developed places. And as a result, they're very much like the rest of the world where, women are more educated, they have more opportunities, societies have changed. And so people are getting married older as a result. That's fine, right? That's very similar to the rest of the world. As a result of that, though, as people get married older, then that has an impact on the birth rate in Asia in a way that's not being seen in the rest of the world. Because as society has changed in say, Europe, as people are getting married older or not getting married at all, the birth rate hasn't fallen in the same way, because it's been it's obviously society acceptable to have children outside of wedlock. And that goes back to the chart that BOK uses, which comes from the OECD data. When you look at Japan and Korea, which are the economies that the OECD has data for, I think if we look at China and Taiwan, the data would look very similar. But the striking difference between Asia and the rest of the world on this metric, it's not the fact that less people are getting married. It's the fact that people in Asia, the proportion of children born out of wedlock is very low. So if you have these two things going on, one, the age at which people are getting married is getting later. And so the success of having children obviously falls if you're only dependent on when you can get married before you can have children. And that's been the problem in Asia. So you end up with this situation where the birth rate is very low and falling very quickly because of this societal pressure not to have children outside of wedlock. So that's really the big issue that Asia faces. And you end up with these two things happening at the same time, right? The health service, which is very good, and so longevity rising at the same time as the birth rate is falling. Now, what's the impact of this on the economy, right? So obviously society, these things are extremely important and big changes, but it's also important for understanding where we are with economies today, and today in particular. And if you look at somewhere like Japan, and Korea actually looks similar in this, the demographics can have an impact on the economy in all sorts of different ways. But one way the demographics should have an impact, the stereotypical way, is, well, the population is falling, right? There's less people. And so if there's less people, you would think that there's less people to be working. But actually in Asia, that hasn't happened. And particularly if you think about somewhere like Japan, and this experience in Japan, I think, has been very relevant for where we look at Korea today. When you look at Japan's economy, actually, as much as the population has been shrinking, the workforce has actually been rising, or at least hasn't fallen in the same way. And the reason for that is because in Japan, as much as the population has been falling and the number of working people in absolutes, the number of people of a working age has been falling in absolute terms, of those people are able to work, more and more of those people are actually going to work. So it's what economists call the participation rate is going up. And the participation rate, particularly of female workers and of elderly workers in Japan, has been going up quite dramatically since 2013 in particular. And that's been a big thing that's offset the fall in the population. So if you think about it, right, like actually, there's this kind of association in the popular mind that Japan, because there is if you look at Japan's experience over the course of the last 30 to 40 years, Japan has had deflation. At the same time, everybody knows that Japan has a falling population and aging is a big issue. And so in the popular mind, these things tend to be put together. That because there's an aging population, it's obviously that's causing deflation. Now, actually, if you look at Asia, there's a lot of other things happening in Japan's economy with the collapse of the bubble, the difficulty of the manufacturing sector has happened, the rise of China as a competitive threat, all of these other things. That's had a big impact on deflation in Japan. When you think about demographics, it's really unclear so far that it should have a deflationary impact. And that can, because if you think about it, from a labor from a labor point of view, if there's demand for labor, but the supply is falling because of demographics, wages should be going up, not coming down. Whereas Japan has had falling wages for years. So it doesn't look like that's the kind of thing that should be happening. The second thing you think about from an economic point of view, one of the kind of classic theories of economics is this life cycle hypothesis for consumption. So the idea of that is that, who saves in the economy? The savers in the economy tend to be the people who work, right? Because they have income. So they're not going to be spending, they're going to be saving that income for when they get older. So in a situation where the working population is large, then you should have an economy which ends up saving more because because the people who are working are the people who do the saving. The people who tend to do the net dis-saving in economies should be the children, obviously their parents are doing a lot of the dis-saving for them, but also the elderly people, right? Because the idea is when you retire, your income falls. Hopefully you have a pension to come back on, but your income's not going to be nearly the same rate it was when you're working. But the idea is that your consumption habits, they don't really change that much, or they don't change quickly. Particularly these days, people like to go traveling. They might want to spend more of their money, like my dad maybe, on a cruise. All of this stuff, right? And so actually it's the elderly people who are dis-savers. So if you think about that, what you could have with an aging population is actually it should be an inflationary economy because you end up with more dis-savers in the economy rather than more savers. And so these two things that have had, so in Japan, you've had this situation where there has been deflation and people it's very common to associate deflation with aging of the population. But if you think about these two economic aspects, the life-saving, the lifetime consumption hypothesis on the one hand, and the dynamics of the labour market on the other, actually it's very easy to think that an ageing population has resulted in inflation in the economy rather than deflation. So if we go back to Japan's experience, why hasn't that happened? It's two things going on. That one, when you look at the elderly population, it's the elderly population in Japan that has most of the assets. And this isn't so dissimilar to the rest of the world. But you don't see that dis-saving happening in the same way. Now, again, one of the reasons for that in Japan is because there is this fear as people get older and they're going to have to spend a lot more on healthcare before they die. So it's kind of a healthcare issue that's going on. A second issue that's happening is if you take the example of Korea, and again, this is something that the Bank of Korea has talked about in the past. You've seen this actually rather than the savings ratio falling in Korea, because it has demographics like Japan, where the population is going to age quite quickly. Therefore, you should have savings rates falling because you have less people working and it's the workers who do the saving, right? So in Korea, you should have the savings rate falling as the demographics deteriorate. Instead, what you've seen in Korea is the household sector has actually been saving more. Why is that happening? One of the explanations is because of this increasing longevity, at the same time as the retirement age isn't going up very quickly. So you have people who are kind of getting to the age of 60 or 65. They realize that they're going to soon be in retirement. And obviously in retirement, hopefully have a pension, but you also need savings to live off in that time. But if you get to the age of 60 and you think your retirement's going to be until you're, say, 80, right? On average point of view, maybe you need, X amount of money. But if you get to 60 and realize actually you're more likely to live until you're 85 or until you're 90, suddenly you realize you need a lot more money than you thought you would have. And so what you have is these populations where longevity is rising. Instead of having this simple situation where people retire at the age of 65, they know how much money they need. After 65, they start to spend money. Instead, you have this situation where people retire at the age of 65. They realize they're actually probably going to live like a few years longer than they thought they might do. They need more money, and so they save more rather than saving less. So in Asia, you have this kind of particular phenomenon where the life cycle hypothesis of consumption really isn't playing out in the way that it would be expected in all the economics textbooks. And as a result of that, you end up with these economies which are not nearly as inflationary as they otherwise would be. And that's an important phenomenon that has been seen in Japan and is now something that's been seen in Korea. Now, what's one of the implications of this, right? What should economies be doing in this situation? Well, obviously, one of the things is to increase the retirement age, because if the retirement age is longer, and this is kind of one of the, again, sort of, I think, underappreciated, facts of like a sort of like a society institutional thing. The retirement ages of 65, they were introduced because the average life expectancy at that time was probably, when the retirement age was 60, the longevity was probably 70 or 75. Now the retirement ages, it's very difficult to increase retirement ages, obviously for political reasons. So they're still around like 65 or thereabouts, but people are living a lot longer. And so these retirement ages really, if one thing that needs to change across all of Asia, across the rest of the world as well, but particularly when longevity is increasing so much, is retirement ages really need to go up a lot. That's true in Japan, is true in Korea, and it's also true in China. And that brings us on to another subject, right? Because obviously, and I think this is, something worth thinking about in terms of China. And it's worth thinking about for three reasons. One, because of the impact on the economy it has. But the second thing is because what it says to us about, one of these kind of classic, well understood aspects of Xi Jinping's China is that he is opposed to welfareism, right? The government doesn't want to spend much on welfare. It wants people to be working. It doesn't want them to be having leisure and consuming. And the third thing is sort of related to the political power of Xi Jinping or the political power of the Communist Party itself. So what's one of the remarkable aspects of China today? Longevity is very successful, right? The government's done a very good job at allowing healthcare standards to improve, and people are living a lot longer than they used to. And this is certainly something that should be celebrated. However, retirement ages for urban workers, and particularly those in state-owned units or state-owned enterprises, they haven't kept pace with this at all. So the government recently has actually passed legislation to change the retirement age. And the retirement ages they're talking about changing are retirement ages of 53 or 55, right? This isn't increasing retirement age from 65 to 70. This is increasing retirement ages from 53 or 55 and increasing them by a few years over the course of the next 15 years. And if you think about that, when you look at longevity changes, longevity is rising by, a couple of years every 15 years. So if you increase the retirement age by, 4 or 5 years, you're still not really getting ahead of the curve. You're just sort of keeping pace with changes in society. You're not reducing the length of time that people are going to be in retirement. So this is, what we've seen in China is that the retirement ages are very low. And although the government, as we went through the end of last year, did talk about changes in the retirement age, the sort of things it's been talking about are very pedestrian. Retirement age, even after these recent changes, is still going to be very low. So going back to those three things, what does that tell us, right? What does that tell us about China today? Well, one, if you think about this idea that Xi Jinping is very opposed to welfareism, doesn't want consumption, the retirement age is something that gets people to work more, right? This would keep people in work. It would keep them away from consumption. And yet the retirement age isn't being increased. So, obviously, it's very true. I mean, Xi Jinping has said explicitly that China shouldn't become a welfare society. And there's been talk about, you don't want to be like Scandinavia, right? That kind of vibe is very clear in the political establishment in China. But if you think about actually what they're doing in terms of these retirement ages, that is the one thing that should be increased very quickly, because it is the sort of thing that will keep people in work. So I think it's important politically. It's sort of saying something about how China works and their attitude towards consumption and the attitude towards welfare. The second thing is, politically, So why isn't the retirement age increasing more quickly? Well, presumably because it's difficult to do so, right? It would be unpopular in China. It's unpopular everywhere. It's also unpopular in China. And so why isn't it happening? Because it's politically difficult to do so. And so obviously Xi Jinping is powerful. Obviously the Communist Party in China is powerful. But even in China, the government isn't so powerful that it can make these changes necessarily that are needed for the economy in a way that you might think, in a democracy, this is almost impossible to achieve. And the third thing is it has implications for the economy. Because if the retirement age remains so low, then you're going to have this problem that has been seen in, Japan and is being seen in Korea today, that the retirement age of 50 or 55 or even 60 in an environment where actually people are living much longer, like the savings ratio isn't going to come down, right? People aren't going to be getting to the retirement age and thinking, well, yeah, like the state's looking after us, we've got all this money in the bank, we're going to be fine. Instead, what people are going to be saying is we're going to be living even longer, we're retiring at this age, we better make sure we've got a ton of money in the bank. So it's also important for the way that the economy works, and is much more likely then that from this point of view, that China ends up with a higher savings ratio rather than a lower savings ratio. And one of the things that drives deflation is people saving too much rather than people saving too little. And so this has implications for the way that inflation will look over the course of the next few years. Now, that's kind of on the China side. If we look at demographics in Japan today. Now, obviously, and going back to this idea, right, like demographics explain everything that's been happening in China, in Japan, and the malaise in Japan over the course of the last 40 years. Again, it's very unclear that that's the case, apart from the fact there's all this other stuff that's happened in Japan. But again, the way that demographics work should mean that in some ways the economy, at least in terms of aggregate spending relative to supply, should be higher rather than lower, and therefore it be inflationary rather than deflationary. But let's leave that aside for the time being. One of the other aspects that is very relevant for thinking about Japan's economy today in terms of demographics is the fact that the population is now shrinking. And so when we look at one of the aspects of Japan's, when we think about Bank of Japan policy and the way that policymakers are looking at the economy today, and the way that a lot of investors look at the economy today, the reality is the economy in terms of growing after COVID, the recovery has been very slow. One of the reasons why the recovery in Japan's economy has been slow is because consumption is still lower than it was before COVID hit, or at least lower than it was before the second sales tax hike as we came in, which hit even before COVID hit. So, the comparison with pre-COVID era is a bit different in Japan from the comparisons you make in the rest of the world. The point is, though, consumption is low relative to where we were previously. But that's only true in an aggregate sense, right? So if you look at an aggregate point of view, consumption is lower than it was in 2019. If you look at consumption on a per capita basis, actually consumption in Japan isn't weak at all. And the recovery particularly relative to Europe, but the recovery in consumption has actually been pretty decent over the course of the last 12 months or so. So what's the difference between those two things is obviously demographics. So on a per capita basis, people are spending more, but because the population is falling, on an aggregate basis, consumption isn't increasing nearly so quickly. Now, there is a sort of flip side to this. So if you think about wages in Japan, one of the key assumptions or the key pillars of BOJ thinking about the economy today is this demographic issue is becoming very relevant for the labour market. So all of this increase in the participation rate of female workers and elderly workers over the course of the last 10 years or so, that can't go on forever. It's a finite process, right? And now, particularly because the female participation rate in Japan is not actually very low anymore relative to the rest of the world. There has been a lot of catch up. So basically a lot of that participation rate, a lot of that slack in the labour force, that's now being used up. So what we're seeing in Japan is increasingly the labour market has caught up to the demographics. Whereas previously you're in a situation where demographics were having a negative impact on the labour market. But because there was a lot of people still not really in the workforce, if those people came into the workforce, it would offset the fall in the labour force, right? So the demographics of the labour force is falling, but more people are of the existing population, more people are working. The two things offset each other and the labour market actually looks fine. The BOJ's view today is that process is now ending effectively, right? It doesn't end overnight, but it's certainly beginning to run out of steam because most of the people who are not working in the labour force who could do are now in the labour force. And so when you think about the demographics, it has these two very different impacts on the economy. If you think about consumption, demographics are now very negative for the economy because the population is falling, therefore there's less people to spend. If you think about it, and so, that would be sort of deflationary for the economy, right? Like it would be something that reduces aggregate demand. If you think about it in terms of the labor market, demographics are actually now becoming increasingly inflationary because you're running into supply side constraints on the labor market. And so if demand is decent, then you're going to have per capita wage growth accelerating. And that's one of the things the BOJ is looking for, to be able to increase interest rates. Now, I think ultimately is that increase in per capita wages, which is much more important for the BOJ and is therefore much more likely to drive policy. But it is worth remembering when you look at the economy and look at economic data in Japan, you've really got to think about it in these two ways. The demographics and the impact on the economy, it's really not just about on the one side, you've got the consumption side, where demographics are negative, if you like, for the economy. On the other hand, on the labor market, demographics are actually quite positive. And so that's something that is relevant for policy today. The other thing, and this is obviously, very topical in Japan at the moment, is, whether the participation rate can be increased further. And again, actually, this is seen both in Korea and Japan. And so, think about Korea today, and this is, I think, also underappreciated at the moment, that there has also been a big increase in the female participation rate in Korea over the course of the last few years. And that's something that's accelerated after COVID. Again, that's a positive development, right? Like it's something to be welcomed, right? Like in many, many different ways. But one of the aspects of this is that as those jobs are being created, more the participation rate is increasing from female workers and from elderly workers in a similar way that happened in Japan after 2013. One of the things that happens is more of these jobs tend to be part-time work, right? And that, again, was something that was seen in Japan as well. But if the number of part-time workers is increasing, actually, then the number of hours worked in the economy tends to come down. So if you think about Korea today, if you look at the kind of the headline labor market data, unemployment rate is very low, right? Like it's below 3%. It's very unusual in Korea's history for unemployment to be so low. But it doesn't really necessarily mean the labor market is very tight because you've got this increase in the supply of workers at the same time as the number of hours worked in the economy is going down because more of these jobs being created are part-time jobs. And so one of the things that tends to happen as labor markets change is labor markets become more flexible and therefore part-time work tends to increase. Now, why is this relevant for Japan today? Because there's obviously been all this political stuff in Japan over the course of the last 6 months or so, right? The leadership election in Japan, Ishiba becoming, prime minister, corner election, which the LDP does very poorly in, and now there's a coalition government. Well, one of the things that the coalition partners are talking about, and one of the things that the opposition parties say want the LDP to do for these opposition parties to continue to allow the LDP to be in government, one of their criteria is to change something which could have a big impact on the labor market. And that is this tax threshold that for part-time workers, if your income rises over around 1 million yen, then you start to pay income tax. And so that effectively is a ceiling on, if you're a part-time worker, you don't want to increase your hours above a certain amount because you're going to start to pay a lot more tax than you were previously. So one of the things the opposition parties want to happen is for this threshold to be increased quite substantially. Now, this is something which is, again, like a lot of things when we think about economics, it has different consequences. So on the one hand, if this happens, it's going to be something that's very negative for the government's fiscal position, right? Japan's fiscal position is already terrible, and it's going to get a lot worse if you say there's a lot of workers who are going to be paying a lot less, going to be working, but paying less tax than they were previously. On the other hand, thinking about the labor market participation rate, this could be very positive for allowing participation to increase further for longer. And so again, thinking about the inflation outlook in somewhere like Japan, and, these other economies, it's not just important to look at the overall unemployment rate, whether it's like 2.5 or 3%, whatever that might be. It's very important to understand the dynamics behind that. What's happened with participation rates? What's happened with the number of part-time workers? The number of hours being worked in these economies? All of that has implications for how the interaction of the unemployment rate with the overall inflation in the economy. And so somewhere like Korea, as much as the unemployment rate is low, it doesn't really look very inflationary at the moment. If you look at somewhere like Japan, the unemployment rate is low, and it looks actually that is becoming increasingly inflationary. And that maybe brings us, onto another economy we can discuss in this context, although probably less from the demographic side, but more just from what's happening with the labor market and what's happening with the economy, and that's Taiwan, where also, like Korea, the unemployment rate is very low. An unemployment rate in Taiwan today is like the lowest it's been in 20 years. Why is that important? Because it does look like Taiwan's economy is actually in quite a good place. So if you look at Korea, in Korea, the data is deteriorating. You've seen export growth slow down from about 10% over through the first half of 2024 to roughly zero as we all get towards the end of 2024. If you look at consumption in Korea recovered during COVID, but has come down quite sharply since. So again, as much as the unemployment rate looks quite... It's all right. That's right. As I was saying, so think about Korea. Like if you look at Korea's economy today, like even before like the president tried to declare martial law and the whole fallout from that, which, wouldn't have been the thing that most people are expecting to happen in 2024. Even before that, which has had a huge knock-on effect in terms of business and consumer confidence in Korea, as we can see in all of the data. Even before that, Korea's economy wasn't looking great. And one of the reasons why Korea's economy wasn't looking great, and the big difference with Taiwan, is you can just see it in the share price of TSMC versus Samsung, right? So these are the two leading companies like in both economies. And if you think about TSMC, I mean, it's sort of, again, one of these underappreciated aspects of the Asian economies, I think. But TSMC is enormous now relative to the size of Taiwan's economy. So it's like, probably 35% of market capitalization. Like it's by far the biggest exporter. Like if you drive around, I just drove down from Taipei to Taichung today, and you see TSMC's fabs being built along the way. Its capex budget is huge relative to the size of the economy. So like both Samsung and TSMC are very large economies. Now, the interesting thing about that, I think, is if you think about, the historical way that people tend to think about these economies, Korea was always this chaebol, dominated economy, right? Like it had these big family-run companies, which are always very dominant in the economy. But people tend to think about Taiwan in terms of this SME-dominated economy, right? Everybody wants to be a Laoban, right? Like everyone wants to be the boss. And so everyone's starting companies, and a lot of these like small, aggressive, very nimble, flexible, export-oriented companies. Like this was the way that Taiwan's economy worked. And that is still important, right? Like, and again, you walk around the streets of Taiwan, you can see lots of people are still very willing to try to open a cafe or try to run a business, right? In a way which you don't see in somewhere like the UK. But at the same time, like there's clearly been a big change in the economy because of the rise of TSMC. Like, and it's so dominant in a way that wasn't the case before. And that really puts it in it makes the economy feel very different. And I think should be very relevant for policymakers and the way they think about the economy. And one of the aspects of this is, if you look at Samsung's share price and Samsung's difficulties, right? Like it's had a bad year. Like it hasn't managed to keep pace with the demand for AI products. It's not in that loop in the way that TSMC is. And so TSMC share price is at record highs. Samsung share price has barely risen over the course of the last 12 months. And that then gets reflected in the relative performance of the economy. So the export sector in Korea isn't doing very well. The export sector in Taiwan is still doing quite well. Exports, even at the end of last year, as data showed yesterday, still rising by 10% year on year, still up month on month, and the numbers look quite good. At the same time, in Taiwan, you also have like the domestic economy looking quite good. So the consumption side and non-manufacturing sentiment is quite strong. And so the labour market being quite tight, unemployment being under 3%, that is relevant for Taiwan's economy when overall aggregate demand is holding up, as these other statistics suggest. And so one of the things you see in Taiwan, right? So coming back to the comparison with Japan in the 1990s, like Taiwan is the economy that has looked most similar to Japan in the sense that there's been no inflation over the course of the last 20 years. If you look at core inflation, which is one of the ways that economists tend to like to look at kind of the fundamental side of what's happening with the economy. Core inflation in Taiwan over the course of the last 20 years, before COVID, averaged 0% or 0.4%, if you want to be particularly precise. So basically, there was no inflation, and there was no wage inflation in Taiwan. And, obviously one of the things that pops up in all of the elections that Taiwan has is like people are very upset because wages aren't going up and so on, right? And that was very much clearly seen in the data. But now we're in a situation where I think that's changing. Because now you do have a situation, unemployment is low and the economy still looks quite strong. And the wage data is still not like super wowy, but there is a very clear sign that there's been an inflection in wage growth. In fact, two inflections in wage growth. One back in sort of 2015, 2016 time, and one during COVID. And if you look at the economic trajectories of Korea versus Taiwan, which before COVID looked very similar. After COVID, Taiwan's economy has taken this step up in a way that hasn't been seen in Korea. And so something like Taiwan is like one of the big, so the economy, I think, is, changing in Taiwan in a way that's not being seen in somewhere like Korea. We talked about the other aspect of Taiwan, which is interesting, which is the trade surplus. And so how trade is reorientated away directly from China directly towards the US, with the result that Taiwan is running this massive trade surplus with the US, like only comparable to what was happening in the 1980s. And the third reason why Taiwan is relevant to be thinking about today is because of the military side. And so, like Trump's people are upset about global imbalances. Trump himself is always upset about the trade balance, but he's also upset about like so-called, the free riding, right? Where these other countries, if we can call Taiwan a country, but these other places in the world, right, where the military spending is not enough. And like Taiwan, is clearly in the target for that, because Taiwan's military spending is only 2.5% of GDP. Like, it's really not very much, given the level of threat that everybody talks about coming from mainland China. So if you're Trump and you're sitting there looking at what's wrong with the world and, how are people cheating the US, we have Taiwan with this massive trade surplus, with an underspending on the military, like free riding on the US. Taiwan looks like it's very front and central. So if you come back and think about like this kind of idea that you want to like reshape the world in the US favor, like I think Taiwan is a key part of that, the key part of that process, I think. Like obviously China's the biggie, but if you think about all the things like the economies that tick the boxes of things that where the US want things to change, Taiwan ticks all of those boxes. And at the same time, Taiwan is obviously very much allied with the US. And so unlike China, where China can resist these pressures because it's like, well, screw you, right? Like everything the US is talking about is good for the US. It's not really clear why it's good for China. But for Taiwan, they don't really have that option in the same way. So one of the conclusions of thinking about Plaza 1 and Plaza 2 and incoming US Trump administration policies, you have trade balance in the US, in Taiwan being very large, military spending not being very much, the economy looking quite good. And so for the first time, in many years, really, like the central bank doesn't need to cut interest rates because inflation is too low. At the same time, all this pressure coming from the US. And so I think there's a potential for a big appreciation of Taiwan currency as a result of this. And that's been talked about for years, right? Taiwan's currency looks undervalued for years and years and years. So, it's always difficult to choose the exact turning point of that. But it certainly does seem like there's a lot of forces coalescing in place that could mean that the currency in Taiwan has to appreciate quite a lot over the course of the next year or 18 months or so. And I think that's quite an important market theme. So I'll get back to thinking about like this difference between Samsung and TSMC. Like, and I'm no expert on the tech side, but obviously it's very important. And it is something we need to certainly track as closely as we can, because it's so relevant for thinking about Korea's economy and Taiwan's economy in particular. And so this difference between Samsung and the experience of T is very relevant for that. Now, what's going on here? Obviously, one of the things here is that, TSMC has managed to ride this AI wave, very clearly. And so this is one of the things that's benefiting Taiwan's macroeconomy in a way that's not being seen in Korea in the same way. And a lot of this is, and this is, again, like the tech people have a much better idea of this, but how much of this is going to be sustainable? Because to the extent it is, if this is like, AI-driven revolution that's going to mean, it's going to put everybody out of a job, right? Like, as the way people talk about it. But it won't put TSMC out of a job, because TSMC is the world supplier of a lot of the semiconductors that are needed for all this AI stuff. And as long as that's the case, Taiwan's economy is much more likely to be an outperformer over the course, going forward than it would be otherwise. So I think on demographics, like it's sort of in conclusion, I guess, right? Like the demographics is one of the key themes for Asia, right? You can't look at Asia without understanding and thinking about what demographics means for these economies. And it's becoming increasingly relevant. And it's already relevant for Japan because of the impact on consumption. It's already relevant for somewhere like Korea because of the impact on the labor market. And it's relevant for China when we think about the retirement age and the impact of that. So it's those things which are very critical to be looking at. And all of them, they don't have simple effects on the economies, but they are having very big effects on the economies. And that's one of the things that I try to cover when I think about what's happening with economies, a lot of the thematic work we do. So if you're interested, please subscribe to these videos and look at our website, eastasiaecon.com, where you'll find a lot more of the stuff that's available and you need to be thinking about. And one other aspect on that, which I guess I'll move on to, but so one of the things I try to do with a lot of the research and the work I've been doing is to try to use good data. Now, that might seem a bit like obvious, right? Like maybe the bar isn't very high. Like, I get all of my data directly from all the government and central bank websites. There's a ton of stuff we can do. Like, I spent a lot of time trying to learn Python and building this data infrastructure together. Now, like, why have I done that? Why is that worthwhile? If you think about somewhere like China, like, it's a place that's crying out for better use of data. Now, like, and I know maybe one of the first reactions to that is like, all the data in China is crap, right? Like, it's not worth it. It's like, it's garbage in, garbage out. And like, with all data in all economies, you have to be careful. Like, you can't just take things at face value. But there's at least some basic things we can be doing or should be doing to understand the way the economies work. And China is perhaps the best example of that, and to illustrate it. And so if you think about some of the data that was released over the course of this week, like, one of the things that came out from China is price data, right? Inflation numbers. And these are the sort of thing that like is the bread and butter of like economists, right? Everyone's trying to look at this stuff. Inflation is critical for economies because it's one of the key things that drives monetary policy. Monetary policy is one of the key things that drives markets. So you can't be a macro economist and you can't be an investor without thinking about what's happening really, with inflation. And the data on that came out from China this week. And so what all the headlines, if you go and look at the FT or you look at Bloomberg or you look at some of the very prominent economists looking at China who really should know better, when you look at the headlines that come out from that, it's inflation is low, like China's in deflation, economic policy that's been announced in China since September isn't working. That's the very common headline we saw this week. Why is that? Because CPI data rose 0.1% year on year. Obviously, it's a very low figure. And actually, it's lower than it was, over the course of the previous 2 months. So, that's where the headline comes from. But it's not an accurate reading of that data point. Why is that? There's two problems with the data. And this is particularly important in somewhere, or particularly prominent in somewhere like China. Like, all of the data in China is published on a year-on-year growth basis, right? Like, it's all published in that way. What's the problem with that? Well, if you have something like COVID happening, right, it was all right when the economies are stable. Like, if you're at growth of 8% last year and it's 8% every month, then looking at a year-on-year growth rate the next year is fine because, you've got a very similar base. But think about what's happened in China since COVID. The economy is all over the place, right? There is no stable base anymore. So when you're looking at a year-on-year base, a year-on-year growth, it really depends on what happened last year. If growth last year was 15% in a month, or if it was 0 in a month, it's going to have a big impact on what the published number is 12 months from that. And that's one of the things that we really need to be doing better in China, not looking at year-on-year numbers, but looking at what's happening month on month. You can get that data. It's not very difficult to do so, but very few people look at it in that way. So that was one problem with the CPI numbers, that it's a base effect. You've got to be very careful in thinking about what's happening today relevant to where we were last year, because it's dependent on what was happening last year. The second problem is, and again, illustrating why the data is important, is because CPI data in China, everywhere in the world, right? Like, there's basically two big components to inflation data. One is energy and food, which central banks, there's different attitudes towards, but everybody knows it's volatile. Like, it has a big impact on inflation, but it's not necessarily telling you anything about the underlying story. So the other thing that needs to be looked at is core inflation, which is inflation, all of that CPI, but excluding what's happening with food and energy. Now, if we take those two things together, so we try to ignore, we don't use the year-on-year numbers, but we look at inflation in terms of a kind of sequential, seasonally adjusted basis instead. And if we look at inflation on a core basis rather than looking at it in terms of a headline basis, actually you end up with completely the opposite headline to the one that everybody was reporting this week, which is inflation went up a lot at the end of last year. So core inflation during the first 9 months of last year was basically negative. So China was in deflation for a lot of last year. Towards the end of last year, inflation on a core basis was back up above 1%. Now, you can definitely argue that that's not going to be sustained. You can definitely argue that that policy hasn't changed enough to have an impact on inflation in a meaningful sense going forward. But you don't think you should be arguing that shows that policy hasn't worked yet. I mean, this was coincident with all of the policy changes that China made from September. So it does look so far that actually policy has had an impact on inflation. So what's the importance of this? I think, particularly somewhere like China, it's very important to try to do some basic work on the data to get a sense of what's happening with the economy. And so much of the media, and to be fair, like a lot of economists as well, they just take the headline published year-on-year growth numbers that are published by the government without really looking into like the details of that and trying to parse really what the story is. And a lot of the work that I do is trying to get that data, look at it in a way which I think is more accurate, and then try to draw some conclusions from that. Now, that's a lot of things I do in terms of the analysis, which, and one of the reasons for doing this is try to make it available for investors and financial market professionals. But I also, one of the reasons for building all this Python stuff is on our website, we have all of this data is available. Like there's a lot of charts, all the data is available, is downloadable. And so, if you go to the government websites and the media, which reports on what the government is reporting, it's all on this year-on-year basis. If you go to my website, you can get all of this this cleaned up data. So you can look at it on month-on-month terms. You can look at it in core basis rather than headline. And I think hopefully this is a useful resource for people to be looking at. Again, particularly in China, where the data to begin with is sort of such a noisy and there's so much stuff in it that you need to clean up. Once you clean it up, it's actually quite useful. And so that's one of the things that East Asia Econ we try to do. So please, think about subscribing to these to these videos where I'll talk about these issues a bit more, but also think about going to the website where all this data is available and you can look at a lot of interactive charts.